and welcome to the Exam Study Expert podcast. I'm your host, study strategy expert and revision technique speaker and coach, William Wadsworth. Now, taking care of our emotional state is an important, but I think sometimes under-discussed aspect of performance in exams. Or if it is discussed, it's really quite a surface level, and we don't really get kind of deep into the practical tools that can actually really make a difference. And of course, I mentioned the idea of, the impact on your performance. But of course, feeling a bit rubbish is pretty unpleasant when we feel anxious or stressed or down or whatever. And that's reason in and of itself to do something about it, quite apart from the impact on our exam performance, as I'm sure you'll agree. Now, back in episode 211, we met the wonderful Dr. Sarah McKay, who gave us a brilliant overview of some of the biggest lessons from the past few decades of neuroscience research that can really help us develop more effective habits as students and scholars. So we talked about things like maintaining your focus, managing distractions, your sleep habits. We talked about metacognition, which, as you might remember, is thinking about thinking. So, for example, understanding your strengths and weaknesses and prioritizing more effectively. And over the course of the season of episodes since we met Sarah a couple of months back now, we've gradually been unpacking some of the big messages that she touched on with the help of expert guests doing a deep dive with us on some of those particular topic areas. So we met, for example, Colin Corby in episode 213 to help us take a break from those tech distractions. We met Nathan Burns in episode 215 to teach us all about the word of metacognition and metacognitive strategies we can use when we're preparing for exams. Now, one of the other things Sarah mentioned in her overview was the research on emotional regulation and how that can, unfairly unsurprisingly, have a big impact on our ability to show up with our work and how we perform as scholars. Now, I think there's some people that have relatively few issues with emotional regulation. I think there's some people for whom this is a really, really big deal. And then many of us are kind of somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. It's a deal in different seasons of our life. Some seasons it's not a problem at all, and then other seasons, perhaps academically, where we're really feeling the pressure, or perhaps we're feeling like we're behind, or it's not going very well, or perhaps there's other life circumstances from outside the academic world that are causing unwelcome pressure, resulting from adverse life circumstances in other areas of life outside your studies. So today we're going to learn some really useful tools to help us deal with all of that and regulate our emotions when they come up. So I'm delighted that I've got some expert help today in the form of Dr. Jenn Veilleux, who's a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Arkansas and also a practicing clinical therapist. So she combines both academic and real-world wisdom, which I think is always a particularly potent combination. And she recently published a major book distilling some of her big expertise in this area. The book was called Open to Emotion: How Acknowledging, Understanding and Regulating Your Feelings Can Improve Your Mental Health. Very rooted in the science and in the research, but also really, really practical and useful kind of practical steps we can take in the real world as well. So as always, you'll find that book linked in the show notes if you'd like to check it out. And I'm delighted today to be welcoming Jenn to the stage here on the podcast to help share some of the big ideas. There are going to be some very useful and very practical tips we can take from today's episode. So let's meet Jenn and dive right in. Enjoy. When we think about emotion, I wondered if a good starting point would be just talking a little bit about, what we know of kind of what's going on in the brain when we experience emotions. Like, what do we kind of know about the kind of underlying mechanisms? What kind of drives emotion? Yeah, just maybe give us a little bit of those kind of theoretical foundations.
Sure. I'm not going to do a great job of explaining what's happening in the brain. That is not my area of expertise, but I certainly can talk about where emotions come from and kind of what's happening there. So a lot of people think that emotions come from the situations that we encounter, right? Where you stub your toe and you're angry either at yourself or at the door, depending on the person. Or you think that, a lot of emotions happen in interpersonal relationships And so that someone else might cause an emotion. A student gets a bad grade from their teacher and they, feel angry at the teacher for causing that bad grade. But that's not really how emotions work. Emotions are generated through a cycle. So something happens. I call it a trigger, but it could be an internal or external trigger. So, like students, for example, are often worried about like thinking about what it might be like to talk in class or thinking about that exam that's coming up. And so, simply thoughts can be a trigger for an emotion generation cycle. And then once that trigger happens in our minds, we pay attention to some aspect. So if someone's thinking about, okay, I have to give a class presentation, one person might think of like all those faces looking at me. Another person might think of, the teacher evaluating me. Another person might think of, I get an opportunity to share this content that I've learned. Right? We would attend to different pieces of the situation. And then we're going to interpret that situation in some way. And it's that interpretation or that appraisal that's really critical for the emotion that we experience. So for the person that's like thinking about themselves sort of performing for their classmates, and they might think of this like, well, I get an opportunity to show off. I get to like think about my skills. They're going to tend to feel excited about a class presentation. Someone who's attending to and sort of picturing those faces of their teacher or their classmates is going to think like, I'm going to screw up, and like they're going to be evaluating me, and they're going to think they're going to poke holes in all of my arguments, and those people are going to feel anxious, right? So it's that interpretation, like what we pay attention to in the situation and then how we interpret it, that is really how that emotion is generated.
Why do we have emotion?
We have emotions for all kinds of reasons, and humans aren't the only ones who have emotions. Animals have emotions too. There's a really great video of laughing rats out there on the internet. You can like tickle rats and see their feelings. Emotions are have a lot of functions for us. So there's several. So we have emotions because they help our body prepare us for action. So most people have heard of the fight, flight, or freeze reflex. Um, that is because emotions help get our body ready for action. If you're being chased by a bear, which for some people, that's what a class presentation feels like, um, then your body needs to like generate nervous system activity so that you can run away quickly. So that's one function. The body kind of helps prepare the emotion, or the emotion prepares the body for what we need to do next. The second is sort of self-understanding, right? If we didn't have emotion, we would have to use logic or reasoning for everything. Animals don't have the same kind of higher power cognition as humans do. And so emotions help us decide all kinds of things, right? Like, what do you want for dinner? Well, what do you feel like having? Like, that's an important piece of knowing how you're responding to the world, right? You like some people, you dislike some other people, you like some situations, you don't like others. Emotions are at the heart of all of our evaluative judgments, which tells us what we like about ourselves and what we like about other people. And then the third function of emotions that's really important is communication. So you could watch a movie in another language and often have a sense of what's going on because you can see the emotions in their facial expressions or body language, or if you have the sound up, you can hear tone of voice even if you don't speak the language. So emotions communicate faster and more efficiently than words. A parent comes home and they see their kid sort of looking dejected and they're like, how are you? The kid's like, fine. But it's obvious the kid is not fine because the parent can tell based on kind of how the emotion is being expressed and kind of leaking out. So that can be a really important clue to sort of try to dig deeper and check a little bit more about what is actually going on with that person.
Really interesting. So, I mean, we obviously evolved to have emotion for a range of important reasons, and
Right.
we would never want to eliminate emotion from our lives, right? It's a really important thing.
A lot of people would love to eliminate the negative emotions from their life, the unpleasant ones, but they serve a purpose too.
Well, talk to us about that then. So I mean, I think we all have this instinct that we'd all kind of have this intuition that emotion in many contexts can be a good thing, even a wonderful, joyous thing. And then there can be times where it can be painful or difficult or unpleasant or might even kind of get in the way of us kind of pursuing various goals. Perhaps just tell us a little bit about some of the reasons humans And in particular, maybe if you've got any, and it can link it back to any kind of sort of the experiences you see your students have as a professor, the times you see your students perhaps struggling with, should we say, unwelcome emotion. Tell us a little bit about maybe the challenges we as humans and perhaps students in particular might have with unwelcome emotion.
Yeah, I think there's like tons of challenges, right? We have emotions for a reason. They serve purposes, even the unpleasant ones. So, what I know, the science says that all emotions have a purpose except maybe one, maybe shame, because guilt and shame are very closely related. Guilt is sending all emotions are sending a message. And so the message of guilt is I've done something wrong. And guilt helps prompt reparative action. So when people feel guilt, they tend to go then apologize or maybe do something differently the next time. But the message of shame is I am wrong as a person. That tends not to be particularly helpful. It tends to just kind of get people into mental loops of badness, and helps people withdraw from others rather than kind of engaging in goal directed activities. So shame, maybe not great. The rest of the emotions are good. Even anger, a lot of people don't like feeling angry, but angry helps people right injustice. Anger is something's been unfair, something's been unjust, and that can help people. If somebody thinks that they got I mean, this happened to me when I was a student, like got an unfair grade, like this question, I didn't get this entirely wrong. There were pieces of this, right? Like I deserve partial credit. Well, you go up and you talk to the professor and you're like, this isn't fair. Some of this is right. Sometimes you get those points back, right? Anger can actually help fuel correcting an injustice. That can be valuable. So, anxiety is the emotion I probably see my students struggling with the most. Anxiety and depression are way up in high school and college students compared to starting in about 2010. Rates of depression and anxiety started to skyrocket in young people, and they've kept going up. It wasn't just the pandemic. Some people think it's social media. I don't know that there's a ton of evidence that it's like definitely social media. But anxiety is the one I see people struggle with the most. And anxiety can be really problematic. Anxiety can also be useful, right? There's this wacky thing called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. Have you heard of that? So it basically suggests
Tell
that
us about. Tell us about. Tell us a little.
there's a relationship, kind of parabolic relationship between anxiety and performance. So when anxiety is really low, performance suffers. You can think about that, like if you're like kind of lazy and you're like, I don't care, you actually don't focus as well. You don't kind of tune in and try as hard. But when anxiety is really high, then it's really hard to think clearly. Anxiety gets in the way. Kids with test anxiety like really struggle. You kind of go in and see the questions, and your mind just goes blank. All the information that you studied for, everything that you knew, is gone when anxiety is really high. But a moderate level of anxiety is actually very adaptive. It's like anxiety can help people focus. Like, okay, I know this. I got to try hard. Like anxiety can help at a moderate level. And so I see students a lot struggling with anxiety and struggling with emotions and thinking if they're having these unwanted or unpleasant emotions, that means that they have to regulate and have to get rid of those emotions. And sometimes that's true. Having an emotion regulation toolbox is really important so that emotions don't get in the way of goals, but they can also facilitate goals. And so my overall message that I send to my students and to my clients is that we need kind of both. We need to be able to harness and use our emotions, get the messages that they're giving us, and sometimes listen to those and follow the messages. And sometimes those messages are kind of junk mail. And, a student might be getting the like, you can't talk in class because everyone's going to judge you. And like, that will actually stop the student from talking in class, asking questions, going to the teacher and asking for help, or even just having a conversation. I love it when students come to office hours to just chat with me, but it doesn't happen all that often. And I think students are scared, and that fear keeps them away. And so that's problematic when people don't have those regulation skills to navigate their unwanted feelings.
I think it'd be fascinating to unpack some of those skills in a moment. One of the kind of contextual question first, and it's sort of perhaps slightly implied in what you've been saying so far, but I wonder what do we kind of know about the fact of the kind of individual differences here. Are we all equally sensitive to emotion, or are some of us naturally more predisposed to be more sensitive to emotion than others?
Yeah, we definitely vary in emotional sensitivity. So here's the one piece of more biologically based brain information that I have. There are tons of people who study emotion from a brain perspective. I am not one of them. But it is the case that people differ in their sensitivities, and we kind of have multiple sensitivity systems. So we have a threat sensitivity system, and we have a reward sensitivity system. So people who are highly threat sensitive are going to be more likely to experience what we call negative emotions. So things like guilt, sadness, anger, fear, jealousy, kind of those things. The reward sensitivity system, people who have us who are more sensitive there are more likely to experience kind of joy, excitement, gratitude, awe, kind of feelings like that. And so a given person could be high in both. One of my kids is definitely high in both. You could be low in both. You could be high in one or low in the other. So we definitely vary in sensitivity, and it's a normal curve, meaning most people on both of these are kind of in the middle. And then there are some people that are very highly sensitive, and there are some people who are very low in sensitivity. And I think what becomes a problem is when people who are wherever they are on the sensitivity spectrum kind of look one direction or the other and then tell people that they're wrong, that people are too sensitive, or that they're some people are called insensitive, or that they're like a cold fish, or, an ice queen, or lines like that. And there's nothing inherently wrong with being anywhere on the sensitivity spectrum, but people get judged or invalidated for their feelings. Often people who are highly sensitive are told that they're too much, especially in cultural contexts where not showing emotion and kind of not displaying emotion is more of the norm. I think here in the US, we tend to be a little more like emotionally expressive than y'all are in the UK.
Maybe.
The stereotype, at least.
That's the stereotype. We've sort of been chatting about some of the kind of, I guess, the challenges of emotion that can come up for people. And I think you coined the term thinking thresholds when it comes to sort of start to think about against some of the challenges with too much emotion. Tell us what sort of thinking threshold is about as a concept.
Yeah, so my grad students and I came up with this term a couple of years ago when thinking about working with therapy clients who often talked about how when they were feeling really strong emotions, or sometimes we would even see it in therapy sessions, that it was really difficult to think clearly. And so um, emotions are basically like a wave. They rise and fall. And so we sometimes have people chart their emotions. And so if we think about where a baseline emotion is, so most people, if we think about a scale from 0, not feeling at all distress, and 100, the most distress that you've ever felt. Most people on a given day hover around like 15, like pretty low distress, sometimes even lower, right? Because people generally live their lives in sort of mild positive affect, most people. And so we tend not to feel a lot of distress, and then something happens, and there's sort of a wave of emotion. And people who are more sensitive have a much bigger wave, right? They tend to react much faster. They tend to get their peak of the wave is really stronger, and then it takes longer for that emotion to come back down. And so we can chart that out and have people kind of look at what their emotional wave looks like. And then I often ask people, like, okay, at what level, from 0 to 100, at what level does it become difficult for you to think clearly? And it's not that people who are strongly emotional aren't thinking. People are thinking, but they're not thinking clearly because the emotion is really infusing itself into the thoughts. That's what emotions do. They color our thinking and our perspective. And so, at what level do people feel like it's hard to think outside of the emotion, that they have trouble thinking kind of holistically and getting perspective? And the answer to that, I've asked hundreds of people that question at this point, and the answer is typically between 70 and 85. That up until that point, people can like kind of retain their thoughts, and then above that, it's very difficult to think clearly, holistically. So that's the thinking threshold, that level of which thinking becomes impaired. And what we suggest is that when people are above the thinking threshold, that they don't try to use emotion regulation strategies that rely on thinking because they're going to be impaired. So, for example, the most studied emotion regulation strategy in the last, maybe ever, but in the last several decades is called cognitive reappraisal. So that is trying to think about the situation from a different perspective, right? I talked about how interpretation or appraisal is really key to the emotions that we experience. And that means if we think about the situation in a different way, we reappraise, then that actually changes the emotional experience. But that is incredibly hard to do when emotions are really high because we can't think clearly. It's very hard to get perspective. The emotion wants you to just think in the way that it has infused your thoughts into thinking. And so when someone's above their thinking threshold, then they need to do strategies that are more behavioral or sensory. So that's the time to, go on a walk, go outside, do. I like to sometimes have particularly when someone's angry or anxious, when their like body is really activated, to like hold an ice cube in your hand because that is a cold sensation that actually helps start to cool down the nervous system. I've had people. I had one client once who used to like do a headstand, just to like feel the blood rush to a different place. But something kind of behavioral and sensory tends to be good. And then when the emotion comes back down, and then when you kind of get below your thinking threshold, that's the time to use more thinking based strategies.
Really interesting. Yeah. So being conscious of where you're at in the journey of processing whatever emotion you're working through. If it's at an earlier point where the emotion levels are still quite high, these kind of behavioural strategies, the ice cube, the stand on your head, go for a walk, and then when the emotion when the emotional wave starts to ebb down a little bit, then we can bring in some of these other more thinky tools maybe. So, tell us a little about cognitive reappraisal then. So you mentioned that as a very well-studied tool. What is that, and can you teach us how to do it, or the basics of how to do it?
Sure, yeah. So cognitive reappraisal is all about kind of trying to think about the emotion from a different perspective. And I think some people don't like cognitive reappraisal. Well, people don't like it for all kinds of reasons. And there's pros and cons to pretty much every emotion regulation strategy that's out there. But cognitive reappraisal is about trying to think about the situation from a different angle. It doesn't mean trying to think about it positively. Not all situations are positive, right? So like a classic example that people are thinking of is like you're, out with your friends, and you see like someone, in the middle of the road because they've just been like knocked over by a bicycle or something, right? And you might feel bad for the person and feel really angry at the person on the bicycle for knocking them over and not paying attention, right? That's a pretty understandable reaction. Well, how would you think about that situation in a different way? Well, like, what if that person on the bicycle was rushing home because their dog is deathly ill? Like, when you can think about like what the other person might be going through, that actually, like, it still sucks for the person that got knocked over and is kind of discombobulated, but the anger goes down because you're trying to think about what else might have happened in that situation that might have kind of prompted this event. So, cognitive reappraisal, you could think about like, is there a potential positive outcome? What might be going on in the other person's mind? What would I do differently next time? Anything that's sort of thinking about the situation from a different angle, being able to think about it more broadly, counts as cognitive reappraisal.
How would you apply that to the case that you mentioned, sort of anxiety related to tests and exams as a common source of emotional challenge for some students? How might you suggest we kind of apply the idea of cognitive reappraisal to that idea that I've got an exam coming up and I'm really anxious about it?
Yeah, so it it will depend a little bit on the circumstance, right? Because the nature of the class, the relationship with the professor, how important it is. Like we can't have emotions about things that don't matter. And so one way to reappraise is just reminding yourself, like, okay, this test is coming up. I'm nervous about it, but this is not the only test. Sometimes it is, but like there are 4 tests this semester. If I don't do as well as I want on this test, there are going to be ways to make it up. Right? That's a perspective taking approach. And so thinking about the bigger picture rather than just this one thing. There are ways to think about cognitive reappraisal in other ways too, right? Like a way to reframe a little more positively is that is consistent with some of the literature on kind of mindsets. That this test is an opportunity for me to like demonstrate my knowledge and this, people who can approach tests like it's a little bit more of a game or it can be fun, tend to enjoy classes and testing better, right? That this is not an opportunity. Tests are not just about evaluating, they're also an opportunity to like think and show what you know, even multiple choice tests, right? Of like, all right, if I can get down to, I know it's these two, that is showing some thinking and showing learning. And so when people think from a learning perspective rather than an evaluation perspective, school tends not to be quite so bad, and the anxiety might still be there, but it would go down a little bit.
Interesting, really interesting. I don't know if this would be an example, but something I've sort of long taught my own students. I don't tend to be an expert on test anxiety, but I work with students preparing for exams, and for many, there's a conversation that comes up at some point about, feeling a bit nervous and feeling a bit anxious, and sometimes something I'll suggest is thinking about your plan B, which feels a bit counterintuitive, but often I've found that there's so much pressure on the plan A. I've got to pass this to progress with my career, and everyone think this. If I don't, or like I've got to, I've got to pass, I've got to get this grade to get into university, and like there's such strong focus on that plan A, to the point where like the plan B is totally inconceivable. That of course we're so there's so much pressure and anxiety sort of surrounding plan A. And sometimes we just step back a moment and think about that plan B and we think it through and we go, well, actually, what would happen if this didn't work out? Oh, well, maybe I might not go here, but I might go here instead. Or maybe this would kind of be my reset plan. And actually, maybe there's a silver lining there because while I wouldn't get this, I would get this. And that might be, it might be da 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 da. And so you sort of make friends with that plan B route. And then it just takes a little bit of that weight off your shoulders, I think.
Yeah, that's a reappraisal. That's a perspective taking, right? When people are really zoned into there's only one possible outcome, of course, anxiety gets higher. But when there's other outcomes, right, then there is less pressure on plan A. And, the thing about anxiety is all about feeling uncertain, and that the future is potentially threatening or dangerous in some way. And so people want certainty because that feels comfortable. But of course, the world isn't certain, and people don't have as much control over their future as they think, right? Like, even if you do great on an entrance exam, it doesn't mean that you're going to get into the school that you want because someone else might have done 14 other extracurricular activities or knows someone on the admissions committee. I mean, there's just a lot of like luck and happenstance, and pretending like it isn't doesn't help. And so having multiple plans and being able to pivot is a form of cognitive flexibility, which is super important because when people have their only plan A, they're also ruminating about it, and ruminating is an unhelpful strategy. Rumination and worry are, when you lump them together, they're called repetitive negative thinking. And it's sort of like spinning your tires in the mud, not kind of going anywhere, just revisiting. I need to have this. What does this say about me if I don't? I have like people are lots of shoulds and lots of like why me's, and those things tend not to promote growth or movement in any direction. So they're unhelpful. So getting perspective and a plan B can kind of help people get out of that, like start to get the car moving again rather than just spinning your tires in the mud.
What else is in our toolbox? What are some of the other tools that we might find useful to that?
Well, it might be useful to talk about procrastination. That's a fun one
Definitely.
that comes up a lot because um, people, procrastination is really emotionally based. It doesn't seem like it is, but it is. So, some of the research talks about procrastination as essentially screwing over your future self. So, what happens when people procrastinate is they look at this task that they have to do, like studying for exam or writing a big paper or something that kind of has multiple steps and it's often high stakes. And they look at all those things that they have to do and feel overwhelmed. And so when people feel overwhelmed and anxious, what do? They want to avoid it. And so they're like, I'll feel like doing this more tomorrow. And so what that does is it sort of assumes that your feeling is going to be different tomorrow than it is today. And the future you is going to just feel more capable of tackling this thing. And so then you go watch TV or like go out with your friends or, do play video games or just do something else. And all that does is punt all the stress over to your tomorrow self. And your tomorrow self is almost certainly not going to feel any more like doing it than yourself today. Now, there's a couple instances where that isn't true. So, the difference between procrastination and strategic delay is that procrastination, you are putting off an important task to the future, and there are negative consequences to that, and it doesn't feel good. Strategic delay involves putting off something to the future, but with a strategy behind it. So, like, if you are sick, like you have COVID or the flu, like, can you think clearly? No. Might you feel better tomorrow? Yes. That's a strategic delay. When people try to kind of work through, like, push through emotional distress or physical pain, like that's not maybe going to work so well. So take a break, rest, drink water, go to sleep, and then tackle that project tomorrow. That's a strategic delay. But procrastination is like assuming that you're going to feel like doing something tomorrow, but you're probably not. And then tomorrow it's going to feel even more overwhelming. And so procrastination has a ton of like people choosing short-term emotional relief over kind of accomplishing the task. And there's some really interesting psychology behind that I think that people assume that to do something, they have to feel like it. And I see this in therapy all the time, and it's definitely applicable to school. And like, people care about their futures, but sometimes the class is not that interesting, or they're studying for an entrance exam, and that's not interesting, or they have to fill out applications for college or grad school or whatever, and like that's daunting and like not fun, just busy work. And so people don't want to do that, which makes sense. And so there's this implication that you have to feel like it to do it. We see it in exercise too, right? Like, well, I don't feel like running. Guess what? I didn't feel like running this morning either. Like I would have rather hit the snooze button. It was raining outside. I did not feel like running in the dark in the rain. And I could have just said, well, I just won't. I don't feel like it, so I won't. And a lot of people make that choice. But that implies that feeling is for doing. And the reality is that doing is for feeling. It's kind of the opposite. So this morning, when I didn't really want to run, I was like, well, I'm going to go run on the treadmill instead. I dislike running on the treadmill. I don't like it nearly as much as running outside. And I couldn't run for as long because it just took a little bit longer to get things going. But I did it, and then I felt good about myself. So when people do things, then they feel better. So what we really need to do is pivot our mindset into like doing is for feeling rather than feeling is for doing. And that can help offset a bunch of the procrastination. There's all kinds of tips and tools to navigate procrastination and kind of that, like navigating that short term emotional relief. One of them is like, just do it and then see how you feel afterward, right? Trying to give yourself a reward, just even if you don't feel like it, do it. And then afterward, spend 20 minutes on video games, use the reward after rather than putting it off. And also trying to think more about the long-term consequences. So if somebody always makes this, trying to think of like, what would, if I always made this choice, if I always put this off, what would that say about me in the future? Do I want to be this kind of person? And most people are like, no, I don't want to be this kind of person. So do the thing now and then see how I feel. And generally, people do feel better and they kind of get into a groove once they start working on it. And then they feel better and then they don't feel like as much of a procrastinator. Sorry, that was a
Fascinating.
long rant.
No, it's really interesting, and one of the top things that our listeners, like students around the world, say is a challenge is procrastination. So very interesting to bring up. Thank you for doing so. Um, I think there's an interesting thing in what you were describing there, which is almost that you're kind of doing it anyway, but there's a little bit of kind of acknowledging how you feel about it as well. You're sort of pausing and stopping and recognizing how you feel, and just giving a little bit of space to that. I think, and that kind of helps you then go right, almost take a step back from some of the like meditation, mindfulness stuff. Step back and kind of just observe it and go, oh, that's interesting. I'm feeling that about it. Right, let me get on with it. Is there a part of that that's yeah,
Yeah, that is so important. I think in my book, I talk a lot about how, it's important to build a toolbox of emotion regulation skills, right? Like knowing those grounding skills, knowing how to use cognitive appraisal. Part of one of the things around procrastination is things feel really overwhelming. So I'm sure one of the things you teach your students is like break things down into steps, because doing things in small chunks is much easier. If you have an application to fill out, well, like fill out your name and address. And then that section that's like, what do you want to do with your life? Okay, that part's a little bit harder. How do we break that into sentences, right? So problem solving involves kind of coming up with steps and making things less overwhelming, right? Not just circling around in the dryer in your mind, but putting together a list. So all those things are really useful. Having a bunch of strategies to navigate emotions is important. But it is also really important to acknowledge how we feel. If we don't acknowledge how we feel, then feelings exert a stronger influence on our behavior. So if we can stop and say, wow, I'm feeling really anxious about this application, and ideally having a little curiosity, like, isn't that interesting? What is the anxiety trying to tell me? So in my book, I talk a lot about like how to learn how to identify which emotion you're feeling, because some people are really good at that and some people struggle. Like they know they're feeling bad, but they don't know if they're feeling anxious or angry or disappointed or kind of a cluster of those feelings. And so learning what feeling it is and then trying to sort of learn like, okay, well, what is that feeling trying to tell me? If you're having a feeling, it means that something matters. So what matters? Well, if someone's anxious, something matters about the test or the project or the application, whether it's that thing or what it represents. So somebody who wants to go to a particular college or university, right? That plan A that you were talking about, right? And they feel like if they don't do well in this thing, that will have a domino effect on the sort of rest of their life. Well, yeah, then a lot of meaning has been put on this one exam. And so when someone realizes that and can say that out loud to themselves, it's actually easier to contradict it and be like, okay, well, this exam might matter, but it's probably not the only thing in my entire world, right? Maybe I can be a worthwhile person even if I like get a B or a C on this test. I can probably still get into a university. Without acknowledging the emotion, though, the emotion just exerts a lot of influence on behavior. So, yes, stopping and kind of attending to what it is that we're feeling and what the emotion is trying to tell you can help you decide if you want to listen to that emotion or not, right? Just like with a friend. Sometimes friends tell us stuff and like we listen to it and a friend gives us advice and we take it. And sometimes we listen to the friend and we're like, that is horrible advice. I am not going to take that. Well, emotions are kind of the same way. They're trying to give you advice, they're trying to be helpful, but they're not you. So they don't always, they are like realistically, right? They come from you, but like emotions are trying to move you in a particular direction and you don't have to listen. And sometimes you should. So you can't make an informed decision about what the emotion's wanting you to do unless you stop and like reflect on it with a little bit of curiosity.
so this is the tool of emotional labeling.
Emotional labeling is the tool of knowing what you're feeling. And then I would extend that a little bit more into thinking about not just what, but what you're feeling, but sort of what's behind it. So in my book, I talk about values and sort of like the values that people have, right? Someone might have a value of achievement, or they might want to get into university because they want a career as a lawyer because they want to help poor people around the world. And so they have a value of, social justice. It's not just about achievement, but it's about like, I want to do this because I want to help people. And so reminding people that like their feelings are coming from somewhere, um, and that can help trying to identify what you're feeling and then sort of what value is underneath it can help people have a little more compassion and curiosity about their emotions, which helps a lot.
You mentioned earlier that if the emotional state's quite intense, you might do the kind of behavioural, sensory strategies, and then when you're sort of a little bit more able to kind of engage thinking brain, you're below the thinking threshold. You can start to do the cognitive reappraisal things. Where does labelling come in? Can we kind of use that any time? Does that need to be when we're below the thinking threshold? Where does that kind of come in?
That's a great question. I think that it could be either. It sort of depends on someone's practice. If somebody's not very good at labeling their emotions, it's effortful and they're going to need cognitive attention. So I recommend, like to me, labeling is what I like to call an emotional conditioning strategy, right? Like athletes go to the gym, they lift weights, they do conditioning drills, right? The soccer players, like or I guess football over there, like they do like foot exercises so that when they're in a game, they can actually respond in the moment when the ball's coming their way, and they can negotiate with their teammates, right? We do conditioning drills ahead of time. I think that emotional labeling is something to practice regularly, including when not acutely highly emotional above that thinking threshold, developing an emotional vocabulary, so that when the emotion comes around, the labeling is easier and we don't need as much cognitive effort so that it can be done above the thinking threshold. There's a couple strategies to do that. One is like there are some pretty decent apps. The app that I recommend the most is called How We Feel. It's a really good app designed by people who study emotional intelligence. It was originally the concept was developed for kids in schools to improve socio-emotional intelligence, but it breaks emotions down into kind of four quadrants. Are you feeling negative and kind of jittery? Or are you feeling negative and droopy? So negative, high or low energy, or positive, high or low energy. And then once you pick a quadrant, it bubbles out and you get to pick a specific word, and it has definitions of the words. It also can ask you to like say, what were you doing right before you started to feel this way? So it can help people start to understand like what kinds of things trigger their emotional responses. So using an app like that where it prompts you a couple times a day and you can start practicing what emotion words mean and kind of doing a self-reflection on like how positive or negative do I feel? How energetic do I feel right now? Those kinds of things can be really useful ahead of time. And sometimes even just using a number, right? I talked about 0 to 100. Like even if you don't have a word, but you can figure out how distressed you are. Like, okay, I'm like an 88 distressed right now. That's above my thinking threshold. Sometimes that can be enough. And then when you come back down, like, okay, what was that? Was that anger? Was that fear? Was that sort of a combination of a whole bunch of things? Was I feeling jealous and guilty and like angry all at once? And you can sort of sift through it later as a way to then teach yourself and kind of learn that labeling so that the next time maybe the words will come a little bit faster.
You're describing emotional labeling as almost like being like conditioning you might do. So it's not just something you do in kind of response reactively. It's something you work on proactively. It's a sort of conditioning. So you have almost those stronger muscles to be able
Yeah.
to emotionally regulate, I guess.
That,
Are there any other conditioning strategies that might be helpful for people to consider along
yes.
similar lines?
Yes. Another one I would recommend is mindfulness. Being able to kind of attend to the present moment. We spend a lot of times in the modern age thinking about the past or thinking about the future and not kind of grounded in what is happening in our minds and bodies and environment in the present. So mindfulness is really helpful as a brain training attentional strategy. When people are anxious and they're thinking about the future and, that this test means that you can't get into this job or this university and then this job and then I'll fail at this and I won't be able to find a partner, right? There's just that train that keeps running. Mindfulness helps people grounded in the moment and like right now, I need to breathe. Right now the sun is shining outside, right now my skin is a little bit flaky, like just trying to ground in the current moment. And so mindfulness is an excellent conditioning strategy. Another is building social support, right? Like, and being in my book, I talk about expression a little bit later, but I think a lot of people, a lot of students who I work with feel like they can't share their feelings because they think their feelings are really different from everyone else's. And they find when they eventually share that their feelings are not actually that different from everyone else's. Like, in my class, I taught an emotion class for undergraduates last spring, and like I think 75% of them had some kind of anxiety disorder diagnosis, which they told me, but they didn't tell each other. They were all so anxious, and I kept wishing that they would just talk to each other. I could like make class into group therapy, and then they could share with each other. Because I actually think if people knew that other people were going through something similar, that they wouldn't. They might still feel anxious, but they wouldn't feel bad about their anxiety because it would feel more normative. So, practicing expressing and sharing emotions, which can feel really vulnerable, I think that is a huge kind of conditioning strategy to use that really helps people.
Vulnerability is very powerful. Fully, yeah, echo everything you said there, Jen. I mean, one thing that I always notice, almost every student, every scholar I talk to has this sense that they feel behind or they're not doing enough, and mathematically that can't be true for every single person.
That's right.
Everybody's feeling bad that they're not doing enough. Everybody's feeling like they're behind, and really kind of okay, maybe in some specific, very specific cases, there might be a specific, if we missed a lot of time through illness or something, there might actually, be, okay, we genuinely got a little bit of catching up. But generally, 99 times out of 100, we're just fine. It's just a feeling. It's not absolutely fine. It's just how we feel about it.
Yeah, which is actually an important point, right? I think we often assume our feelings are real, so that's important. But our feelings do not necessarily reflect the facts of the world, right? Feelings are feelings, they're not facts. And so someone might feel behind, and like that feeling might motivate them to do more. Like there can be some positives, but like objectively, you're right. Not everyone who feels behind, that cannot be true. And people are often not as behind as they think. And when as people assume that their feelings are correct, right? That's that kind of anxiety, like, well, if I talk in class, then people are going to judge me. Well, like, no, you're going to talk in class, and people are paying far less attention to you than you think. There's a great scene from the TV show Schitt's Creek where one of the characters is going for a driving test, and his sister's like, they're not listening. They don't care about you. He's like, they do. They care about everything I do. And she's like, they don't. They don't care. They are paying more attention to themselves than they are to you. And he has this real freeing moment where he realizes that, because it's true. People are like, yes, if you're speaking in class, are some people paying attention? Yeah, kind of. But they're thinking about themselves more than they're thinking about you. And we conflate our feelings with what's going on in other people's minds. And it's just not true.
Fascinating stuff. And Jen, there's so many really interesting things we've covered. Is there anything else that we've missed that you think is really important that, if you perhaps thinking of your students that we haven't touched on today, is there anything particular that we haven't mentioned that you think we should have done?
Well, I guess I would just say that like emotions are important to have, and they are important to regulate. And so people need to learn flexibility in both, right? We've got to learn how to feel our feelings, harness them, kind of listen to the messages, because sometimes they're guiding us in an important direction, and sometimes they are kind of too big or out of whack of the situation, and we actually do need to regulate them to be able to attend to our goals. And so people need both. It's not, a lot of times people come to me and they're like, I need coping strategies. It's like, actually, you need to like lean into your feelings a little bit more and not try to, once you feel something, immediately get rid of it. we need both pieces. And I think that's what makes emotions so difficult and why emotions are really complicated is there's no good recipe for when to feel and when to regulate. It's very person specific. And so I think that learning more about, your own emotions in general can help people start to figure out intuitively that that flexibility. And that's what I think is really important. And that's why I wrote my book, is because there's a lot of science out there about emotion that is hard to get behind paywalls that I really want people to be able to have access to.
Well, that brings us nicely to our close. Jenn, tell us where we can go to find out more. Tell us more about the book. Where would you suggest people go for further reading on this subject?
Yeah, the book is called Open to Emotion: How Acknowledging, Understanding, and Regulating Your Feelings Can Improve Your Mental Health. Look at that right there. And so you can get the book on Amazon or on the American Psychological Association website. But if you Google the name of the book or you Google my name, you should be able to find it pretty easily.
We'll pop a link in the show notes as well to help people find it as well. And it's very readable for lots of really good, lots of really sort of interesting science, but also it's very practical. There's a lot of really good practical things in here as well, as listeners probably have got a sense from our conversation today. It's been really applicable, really practical, really useful. So I'm sure lots of people will take lots and lots away from today. Thank you on behalf of us all, Jenn, for being so generous with your time and your wisdom. Thank you once again. It's been such a pleasure to chat.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.